Welcome to the Faces podcast. We're a Christian and Muslim charity working to build resilience in faith communities against child sexual exploitation and other forms of harm. We'll be talking about what faith and interfaith work means to us and how we embed an inclusive and authentic approach throughout our work.
Welcome to our podcast today. Myself, Nigel, I'm joined by Melissa and Courtney. Courtney last joined us back in February when we were discussing refugees, and today we're looking at that subject again a few months on and looking at how that's developed and also some of the things that are developing as a result of that. And so I hope we can have a good chat today. Just thinking about things in February, we were looking at the number of people in hotels around the UK, and especially in Luton at that time. Since then, there's been many other towns experiencing people in hotels and looking at how people are welcomed into society and into the places around them. And things have moved a little bit. The government's made some moves for fast tracking people, and they've made statements like that. There've also been some very strong statements about people on boats, and there's been a lot of people speaking into this over the last few months. So I just sort of wondered, are the hotels as a temporary solution, is that looking more temporary, or are people being moved out of hotels? Just wondering where the situation is. Wondered if maybe, Courtney, you could just sort of say how things have moved in those months, maybe.
Sure. Before I start, thanks for having me back. It's really difficult to say what the future looks like in terms of hotels. I know there's a lot of rhetoric by the government and media saying that this is, absolutely now an extremely short-term process, and that they're looking at alternative means, whether it's the barge that they've now recently announced that they're going to try and make into suitable living accommodation for refugees, if it's the processes to fast track people. They're trying different strategies to try and reduce the number of people that have to be housed in hotels. But on the ground, we haven't seen any changes in terms of reduction in use of hotels. If anything, contracts seem to be coming to an end. Ones that were in place around 2 years is kind of the mark that we're seeing that hotels have been contracted for. And then it's just a shift to a different hotel. So within our region of Bedfordshire, we've had a new hotel open where previous hotels in London have closed. And it's just kind of a moving of people rather than an actual solving of the problem.
A sort of shuffling of the deck rather than anything moving forward. Wow.
Yeah.
And all the time with this threat of Rwanda, that's never really happened in the background as well. Very interesting. And so, so things have moved around. And during that time, I'm guessing there may be more people involved than there were before, or less. There seems to be people very keen on helping refugees around my area, to link up with, different centres during the day and things like that, which is better than what happened at first. But I'm just wondering, have things moved on in terms of that? Are there more people involved? Are things better set up than they were? Are voluntary organisations getting involved more or less, or was it an initial surge and then it pulled back? Or just wondering what your experience is of that. I'm not, you don't know everything about everywhere, but just in Bedfordshire, kind of what have you observed is probably the best thing to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I don't know what's happening nationally. I just know what we experience. And I think when new sites open and kind of populations increase in areas in Bedfordshire, we've seen definitely a kind of surge of volunteer support, which is a natural progression that you would have if you've got a new community that have just come to a location. Really kind of grassroots community groups come together, and we've seen kind of an increase in collaboration at the early stages, which when I first started, in the sector, it was a little bit disjointed, but now it seems to be the immediate thing is a community group will come together, a kind of leading charity or organisation that has the most experience will try to coordinate all of those responses. And then people meet the emergency needs, which is usually clothing and just a bit of advice and guidance about the local area. And then we do see a kind of de-escalation and scaling back of support in the community context, because people naturally start to get a bit settled. They investigate the area for themselves and find, things that meet their needs. So there's not that urgent need for a lot of community investment. But I think, so it's difficult because in some of the locations that these hotels are now being shifted to, so for example, in the big cities where the contracts are coming to an end and the new hotels are being commissioned, they seem to be increasingly in kind of rural areas. So we have one that's around, I think it's about 8 miles north of Bedford, and it's really, really isolated to the point where there is actually a minibus on site to take people to and from any sort of facilities, because there really is nothing. So in that sense, the community response and the local volunteer response has been really intense, and it probably will be for the foreseeable because they're completely isolated in that location. So it does seem that the voluntary support seems to come in waves and meet the needs. But we've got all sorts of kind of community investment, from organizations to just individuals that get in touch and say, how can I help? I have this, and this, or my skill set is this. What can I do? So it's really reassuring to see.
That's great. And I'm guessing churches and mosques and religious organizations are very key in this. Would you say that's the case?
100%. Yeah. A lot of the time in our collaboration, when new sites open, the churches or the places of faith are at the forefront of kind of coordinating those community efforts. And, volunteer bases usually come from the faith groups. So definitely.
And I understand you and Melissa have been working together on trying to look at courses for volunteers and helping people. Do you want to say a little bit about that, either of you or both of you?
Yeah, but before we do, I was just thinking, as you're talking about the movement of people and how actually that often happens in, a large number of people where the hotel is closing down and being moved to another location. I was just thinking about how much this really makes people more vulnerable. Already vulnerable people who have been through a range of traumatic experiences and come from, having experienced a lot of problems that we would put into a kind of safeguarding category already. But when you're moving someone out of a place where they may have some stability, where they have relationships, they understand and have familiarity with the context and support structures around them, when you take that from them, we're really creating a vulnerable environment for them to enter into, and they're at risk of exploitation, as well as hostility that we've seen and everything that comes with that. And it does seem to not be something that's taken into account. We often hear that the message is people are moved and placed in areas where there's been a lot of consideration about this being the best place to do that. But it seems like the actual well-being of the people that we're talking about is not what's being considered. It's much more of a sort of financial and political, game, rather than thinking about what's best for the refugees that are in the situations that are having to be managed. So in terms of the safeguarding course, we're putting something together for people that we know are trying their best to mobilise and organise and respond to the massive need that we've seen in Luton and the surrounding areas, as you've touched on, Nigel, because people do want to help. People are really sincere in their wanting to help people that they see are in need, and wanting to, like you said, Courtney, offer what they can, whether it's skills or sort of practical things, tangible things. Excuse me. And these people, all of the organisations and individuals that are involved deserve to be supported. And if we can feed into that by offering safeguarding expertise, offering practical tools that can be used, offering a space, facilitating a space that helps them unpack what their processes are, how they can be kind of improved, and how we can make sure that the safeguarding element, which needs to be an integral element in the operations of supporting refugees and asylum seekers, if that can be robust and make sure that functions well, then that can also put an ease on the rest of the rest of the operations that are happening to support them. So that's what we're trying to do. We're hoping to have a course ready by the end of next month to pilot with local organisations. And then we'll hopefully be able to see kind of improvement of how equipped volunteers are to work with refugees and asylum seekers, and make sure that there's no safeguarding issues falling through the gaps, essentially, and that the systems are really robust to make sure that both the refugees and asylum seekers themselves and also the volunteers and organisations are protected.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think it sort of almost flies in the face of what you were saying at the beginning of what you said there, of people being moved from place to place, making them more vulnerable. Bringing a course in that helps people in how they care for people better, and also helps the safety of those people themselves, is exactly flying in the face of just move people around, doesn't matter kind of approach, and has a lot of humanity, a lot of care in it. And I think some of the elements that are specific to this, apart from normally just caring for people, in my involvement with homelessness, very often there's a lot of people who want to do good, but by doing good, in the end, don't do as much good as they think they are. They buy a tent for someone when actually that person needs their mental health addressed by a team rather than a tent in that location at that time. And so there's this balance of how people are cared for and how the best way to go about that is. And so I've seen that in other settings. How would you say in this setting there are particulars of how people need care, or volunteers need to consider things that they might not otherwise consider, that would be useful for them to know or to benefit from without, there's a whole course to go on, but I'm just thinking some of the elements of that, what is important people know, or what elements are important that you would say be specific to this refugees?
I think just sort of fundamentally, a lot of the time when people see an event or a place that they can go and give some of their time, give a couple of hours a week to, it can be seen as, and it should be in the sense of being accessible and allowing anyone who wants to help to be able to help in the way that they can. It's casual, and it's kind of, I can just show up and sort of be doing a few things on the day. But really, if we're really going to take safeguarding seriously, it means that everyone who's involved in that project understands what safeguarding is, understands what abuse can look like, understands what a disclosure is, because it's not necessarily just, this thing happened to me, but being able to read other signs, being able to understand when disclosures might be withdrawn, and knowing what to do if that concern. So even if it's not a disclosure, but if it's a concern that someone has because there's signs of types of abuse happening, understanding what to do with that, who it's reported to internally within the organisation, what the processes are in reporting that, writing things down, recording it, where that's going to be recorded, and where that goes afterwards, how the safeguarding lead ideally is going to follow that up, what local organisations they can contact for advice and support, and national ones as well, places that they can seek advice specifically for safeguarding issues that might arise in a refugee context. And so all of that can seem quite a lot for a volunteer who just wants, I say just, I'm downplaying it, but, just wants to give a couple of hours a week to support a project. But actually, it really will help them in the long run to feel more equipped and to feel more capable in the role that they're doing, and potentially support them in other areas of work as well. It will help them beyond their kind of initial volunteer role there. I think generally it's that mind frame, isn't it? It's that mindset shift to actually seeing safeguarding not as safeguarding, and also the procedural side of things, not as, it's a burden, or it's a bit complicated, but trying to break that down so that it's understood that it can be simple, and that it's really, really worthwhile and necessary.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And Courtney, anything you'd like to add into that?
No, I think Melissa has covered it all really, really well. You know, I was thinking as she was talking, and I was thinking, oh, yeah, I would have said that. So, yeah. So thanks a lot there, man.
That's very, very good. An ace shot, as it would be in tennis, isn't it? There's no return. Looking at that safeguarding, does that include, because I imagine in this that criminal gangs and situations like that have been a problem in this area. You know, people have disappeared from places, and there's been some of that in the news. Is that part of volunteers trained to look out for some of that, or to help refugees defend themselves from that? Is there any of that in the training? Or is it
so we'll be looking at a range of case studies that illustrate different types of abuse that can happen, including exploitation, including criminal exploitation and organised crime gangs. So that will be a way of really giving a kind of tangible story for the people on the course to look at and understand and see how it might apply to their own situation and the people that they work with. So hopefully we'll have kind of a good way to let that sink in, let people read these stories and case studies and kind of go away and remember them beyond the safeguarding, so they can, maybe hopefully not ever having to, but maybe being able to make that connection in future to say, actually, that's what this might be. I've seen these things coming together, and actually that could mean that this type of abuse is happening, and knowing what to do with it at that point as well, knowing where to go with those concerns and how to take action.
Yeah, so ongoing protection all around, it just seems a really wise thing to do. But I'm also just thinking about the disclosures as well that you mentioned there, Melissa, and maybe Courtney wants to chip in on this as well. But I just imagine people traveling through several different countries who've been in awful kinds of situations in some of that. There must be some horror stories there that people, once they begin to feel comfortable and secure, can begin talking about. And I'm imagining some of those settings, there's a fair bit of horrendous content that some of these volunteers may encounter. And I'm guessing you're helping prepare them for some of that. But also, some of these events are happening outside of our country. Hopefully, and so how are those followed through? They're fed to authorities, but I'm just wondering how that works through, and how people work through some of that. So I'm just sort of asking a bit more about the process, and also some of what people will encounter.
So, I mean, to speak to the need for this course, I think you've highlighted something really important, and one of the big motivative drivers for us to develop the course is that area around disclosures, in the sense of, in any, you as you said, it could be a situation where people start to build trust, start to feel more comfortable, and then they disclose information. But in my experience, by representing or presenting as someone that's there to give support, sometimes that's enough for people to want to just express and tell you about what's happened to them, and ask for help. And, this is why I think it's so important that we're developing this course, to give people the tools and skills and knowledge to really know what to do with this, but also to make kind of organizations and groups aware of what they need to consider in terms of looking after and supporting their volunteers, because it can really come out of the blue. It can hit you hard. And whether you are affiliated with an organization or not, if you are professional, if you have experience or not, sometimes people see you as a professional, whether that's true or not, and just disclose things because they're desperate. So that's been a big motivator for us to actually put this course together and make it really accessible and comprehensive. But I'm sure Melissa can explain more about the safeguarding specifics around disclosure. But yeah, thanks for touching on that. It's really important.
Yeah, I was actually going to pick up on the same thing in terms of the psychological well-being of the volunteers themselves, in potentially and often likely hearing really difficult stories. And yes, there's a level of action that might need to be taken in terms of, or will need to be taken in terms of supporting the refugees and asylum seekers, whether it's sort of counselling, mental health kind of well-being support, or it's more unpacking, abuse that's happened and how to take action on that. But it's for the volunteers themselves, that really can't be something that's missed in any kind of project or response that's happening. It's making sure that your volunteers are looked after. We had a really good example of a local group that's been doing work for years supporting refugees and asylum seekers, of them having those volunteer catch-up meetings, and they need to be regular so that you know that if there is something that your volunteer wants to share or needs support with, you're inviting them to come into that space and explain that, rather than it maybe not being mentioned if you didn't create that space otherwise. So something like that in itself is a really good example of something that's generally simple to kind of put together and make sure is regularly kind of in the calendar to have, but just those regular catch-up so that you know that people have a space to say, actually, this happened, or I heard this and I'm struggling with it. I don't know what to do with it. That's just one way of making sure you're not missing where people, including your volunteers, might need extra support.
Yeah, and imagining by feeding things into authorities, there is a chance that even if people are moved from hotel to hotel, that is recorded and can follow them. But I've seen systems break down in many settings recently, and so I'm just sort of thinking, are there ways that can be? So, say someone divulges something that has happened to them, and then they moved to another hotel, is there a possible linkage where counselling or something else could follow up on that? Or are we in a system that's just, we don't know? But it's how some of those things for the person, I'm thinking, not just the volunteers will be static, hopefully staying in locations, but sometimes if they're moving hotels or things like that, or moving into other settings, is there an ability to continue any care for the person divulging what's happened to them?
Yeah, so it does depend on the situation, the context, and where it's been reported. But the Home Office operates a charity called Migrant Help. I won't say too much about it. People can form their own opinions. But technically, you should be reporting safeguarding issues through that charity. And then they should be recording it with the Home Office, with the accommodation providers. And that should provide the kind of trail, regardless of where people are moved. That should be a clear mechanism that allows people to be supported wherever they go. I said I wouldn't say too much about it, but in my experience, we've had people with severe mental health problems, with, suicidal ideation and intent, and really serious issues, safeguarding issues that have been reported through that charity. And in one instance, they didn't call back for 2 weeks after reporting something linked to suicide. So on paper, yes, these mechanisms are there, but whether they actually transpire and work the way that they should is a whole another story. But if people, obviously, if they're engaged with the NHS for whatever care and support they need, that's quite successful. If they're engaged with national charities and refugee support charities like the Refugee Council, like Care for Calais and other national organisations, there's highly likely teams across the country in different sites that people are, large groups of refugees are. So we would hope that some sort of care can be carried forward if it's reported in the right way.
So it's important that the centres themselves that are helping, or the organisations, keep records themselves, so that if the ball is dropped elsewhere, that continuity can be traced back and worked through. Is that something that's in the thinking as well?
Absolutely. And, even today, Melissa and I have been discussing the development of this course, and it was something that we drew upon quite strongly, is the internal need for record keeping, and having a clear trail of what has been done is so valuable and important. And it can, we know things get dropped and balls get dropped across all organisations, but where this happens and we've got clear audit trails, it just makes it so much easier and hopefully more successful to pick back up.
Sounds great. And do you want to tell us a little bit about how you see the course going? So, I mean, it's not long now before it starts. Yeah. So I imagine a whole group of people, say in a setting, who've been helping refugees, all coming together for a training session. I'm guessing they start with teas and coffees, and then they settle down. What happens next? How would you see that flowing?
So like all of our training courses, we really try to focus on facilitating conversation and learning between the participants, because we know there's a lot of experience and expertise in the room. And actually, there's so much value in just being able to facilitate that learning between the people attending. So throughout the course, there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of looking at case studies to really solidify the kinds of things that we've been talking about, and kind of make things less conceptual, sort of just concepts and language, but actually see how it really translates into real life. So there'll be a lot of that. There'll be a lot of having the participants themselves discuss on the tables and present ideas to each other. And we're also going to be looking at quite a lot of kind of the cultural and in terms of the organisation, what kind of cultural values do they hold, and what are the intentions of volunteers and things like that. So just really kind of share those ideas to make sure that people understand each other better, and why they are in the role that they're doing, but also just get to unpack some ideas that might actually be misunderstandings within, in terms of how we view people, how we treat people, and things like that. And again, like our other courses as well, we'll be looking at identity, and we'll be looking at how ideas and perceptions around groups of people can influence the way that we work and the way that we can respond to certain ideas, because we hold potentially misconceptions about how some groups are, or how some types of abuse might present, for example. So there'll be a lot of that kind of stuff. It is going to be a long course, and we feel like it needs to be, and it could probably be twice as long if we wanted it to be. But we're looking at 2 4-hour sessions at the moment, which can potentially be broken down in different ways. And like our other courses, we intend for them to be CPD accredited, so that there is a certificate and there is kind of an acknowledgement that participants get to go away with as well. And we'll also be trying to tailor those certain sections in particular to the organisations that are attending. So actually looking at policy and procedure that's specific to what they are doing and how that can be improved quite practically. So it won't necessarily be that once they leave the course, that's when the real work starts. That's when the kind of changes might have to be made, or certain things might have to be tweaked. But we'll try to create space within the course itself to start the ball rolling on those things.
And how do you see the course, Courtney? Are there anything, because I know you've looked into this area for a long time, you've had care and compassion into this. Are there things in this course that you think, yeah, we're going to do this and it's really going to hit home? Are there things you are excited about with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just excited about the course as a whole, because in my years in the sector, I haven't found something that's as kind of tailored and bespoke to the refugee sector in a really accessible and local context. So I'm excited to be able to be part of the development and implementation of that. So as a whole, it's very exciting. And I think, yeah, about that. But in terms of the practicalities, I like the fact that I've worked with volunteer organizations and just organizations in general where you don't really get to know all of your colleagues. You don't get to know their motivations as to why they volunteer, especially in some of the local volunteer organizations. It's so busy and intense that it's kind of, you might bump into each other or know a name, but actually having a course where people can come and learn that about their colleagues is so valuable, because it just puts everything else into context, and it can really tick some boxes that people, when it comes down to, like Melissa said, misunderstandings, misinterpretations, it can really help to bust some of those myths and misunderstandings. So I think having a setting where we can have open, honest discussions, focused discussions about the true, realities of asylum in the UK and how things work and the importance is a really rare and quite valuable experience. So yeah, I'm just excited in general.
Yeah, I think it just sounds good all around. It's good for the refugees, good for the volunteers, and good for the climate around that and the working together. It's got a cohesiveness about it that just sounds very, very good. So if people hear this and are thinking, yes, we want that kind of approach in our area or where we are, how do they get in touch? I'm guessing, Melissa, you've got some contact details that might be useful.
Yeah, so our email is admin@faces.org.uk. That's the best way to get in touch with us about the refugee course, but also any of our other courses, which the details are on our website, on our training page at faces.org.uk.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. And I look forward to our next installment, which will hopefully have some great stories of what's come from these as well in other settings as well. But thank you both. And
thank you.
Thank you very much.